the complete story of the New Testament. For 400 years, heaven said nothing. No prophet, no vision, no voice. The last words of the Old Testament were a promise. And then, silence. An entire people waited. And somewhere in that silence, a question formed that no one dared ask out loud. The New Testament is the answer to that question. 27 books, 9 writers, fishing boats, prison cells, and a remote island in the Aegean Sea. And most people have only ever read it in pieces. They know the parts. They have never seen the whole. Today, we are going to tell you the complete story of the New Testament, from Matthew to the book of Revelation, as one unbroken thread. By the time this video ends, you will have a complete understanding of what the New Testament is, how every book connects, and what the whole story was building toward from the very beginning. Not pieces, the whole picture. If you are new here, subscribe. This is what we do on this channel. We follow the thread. Did the promise survive? Let us start. If you want to understand why the New Testament begins the way it does, you first need to understand why it was written 4 times. The 4 Gospels are not 4 biographies of the same man. They are 4 deliberate witnesses, each one aimed at a different audience, each one making a specific case. Matthew writes to a Jewish reader. He opens with a genealogy stretching back to Abraham, and every page after it is loaded with prophecy fulfillment. This is not a general biography. This is a legal argument for a Jewish audience. Mark writes to a Roman reader, "There is no genealogy. There is no birth story. Jesus is immediately in motion, moving, healing, confronting, action over ancestry." A Roman would recognize this shape immediately. Luke opens his account with a sentence that gives him away. "I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning." That is not the language of a memoirist. That is the language of a legal brief. And John writes last. Decades after the others. He does not begin with the birth of Jesus at all. He begins before the universe. In the beginning was the Word. That is not biography. That is cosmology. 4 witnesses, 1 subject, 1 case. But before the ministry begins, before the sermon, before the miracles, before the trial, the first act of the New Testament is not a sermon at all. It is a manhunt. And the promise, when it finally arrived, did not arrive the way anyone expected. No palace, no procession. A young woman from a village no prophet had ever praised, giving birth in a feeding space for animals, because there was no room anywhere else. Luke chapter 2, verse 7. The most anticipated arrival in 4,000 years of waiting, and almost no one on earth noticed. But someone did. Magi arrive from the east. They arrive in Jerusalem, not Bethlehem. And they ask the wrong question in the wrong city. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Herod hears it, Rome's client king in Judea. He recognizes the threat immediately. He calls his advisors. They cite Micah 5, verse 2. Bethlehem. He sends the Magi with one instruction: find the child, report back. They do not come back. And Herod issues an order that has been issued before, by another king, for the same reason. Every male child 2 years old and under in the region of Bethlehem is to be killed. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. This has happened before. In the book of Exodus, a Pharaoh gave the same command, in the same shape, for the same reason. A deliverer had been born, a deliverer who would end his empire. Moses survived. He was hidden. He escaped into a foreign land. He was called back, and he led his people home. Jesus survives. The family flees to Egypt. Matthew quotes Hosea 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt I called my son. That verse was originally written about Israel's exodus. Matthew is applying it to Jesus deliberately, because Jesus is not just a person. He is Israel, the entire story of Israel, compressed into one life, and this time lived correctly. The deliverer survived. Again, then silence. 30 years of it. The Gospels record almost nothing, and when the silence breaks, it breaks with a sentence most readers walk past without noticing. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. John chapter 1, verse 14. The English word we translate as dwelt is the Greek word eskenosin. It comes from the word skene, which means tabernacle. The tabernacle was the portable tent in the wilderness, where the glory of God dwelt among Israel, the place where heaven touched earth. For 600 years, the Holy of Holies in the temple had been empty. The Ark of the Covenant had disappeared during the Babylonian exile. The room at the center of Israel's worship, the room that once contained the visible presence of God, was hollow. And John is telling his readers that God did not go back to that empty room. He built a new one, in a human body. The Holy of Holies was no longer a room. It was walking through the streets of Galilee. The ministry begins with a river and a wilderness. At the Jordan, John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. And for the first time in Scripture, the three persons of the Trinity are simultaneously visible. The Son in the water, the Spirit descending like a dove, the Father speaking from heaven. And then Mark uses a word that most translations soften. Immediately, the Spirit drove him into the wilderness, not led, drove, 40 days, in the desert. Israel wandered 40 years in that same wilderness and failed at every point where testing came. Bread, testing God, idolatry. Jesus faces the same three temptations. And every time he answers from the book of Deuteronomy, the book Moses wrote for Israel in the wilderness. Jesus is not simply resisting temptation. He is reliving Israel's story and getting it right. The arrival is deliberate, loaded, precise. But what he built, what he called the kingdom of God, was not what anyone was expecting. And he proved it on the very first mountain he climbed. Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. He went up on the mountain. The geography is not accidental. Moses did this. Moses climbed a mountain, received the law, and brought it down to the people. Every Jewish reader in the first century knew that shape. And Jesus climbs a mountain, sits down, and begins to teach. But something is different. 6 times in that sermon, he repeats a formula that no rabbi in Jewish history had ever used. You have heard it said, "But I say to you," the rabbis of that era always cited their teachers. That was how authority worked. You proved your case by naming who taught you. Rabbi Hillel said this. Rabbi Shammai said that. Jesus cites no one outside himself. In first-century Judaism, this is either the most arrogant thing ever said or the most truthful. There is no middle ground. He is not offering an interpretation of the law. He is speaking as the one who gave it. Then he begins to teach in parables. And most readers assume the parables were a gentle teaching technique, simple stories to make hard truths accessible. That is not what Jesus says they are for. The disciples come to him privately. They ask, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" His answer, in Matthew chapter 13, is not warm. To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For this reason I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see. The parables are not a pedagogical choice. They are a judicial one. He is sorting his audience, filtering them. The parables are simultaneously revealing to those willing to hear and concealing from those unwilling. The gentle, accessible Jesus of popular imagination does not survive this passage. This Jesus is making deliberate decisions about who receives what and why. Then he chooses 12, not 11, not 13, 12. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples. The number is a statement. He is reconstituting Israel around himself, and the composition is deliberate. Matthew, a tax collector who worked for Rome. Simon the Zealot, part of a movement dedicated to violent resistance against Rome. A collaborator and a revolutionary in the same room, on the same mission. The kingdom does not simply cross ethnic lines. It crosses the lines that define who is your enemy. Then come the miracles. Except John never calls them miracles. The Greek word John uses is semia, signs, not displays of power, signs with intentional meaning. Each one is a sentence, and the sentences are being assembled into an argument. When Jesus gives sight to the blind, he is not simply healing an individual. Isaiah chapter 35 specifies the restoration of sight as a marker of the coming messianic age. When Jesus feeds 5,000 people in the wilderness with bread, he is standing on top of the Exodus story. God provided manna, bread from heaven. In the wilderness, when Jesus stands in a boat during a storm and speaks to the sea, he is doing what Psalm 107 says only God does. He stilled the storm to a whisper. Only God commands the sea. John is not recording acts of kindness. He is assembling a legal brief. Every sign is a sentence. The sentences form an argument, and the argument has a verdict. And then, on a mountain, in blinding light, the Old Testament itself shows up to confirm it. He takes 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. He leads them up a mountain, and his face begins to shine like the sun. Moses appears, the law. Elijah appears, the prophets. The entire Old Testament, its 2 great pillars, standing with Jesus in conversation. A cloud covers all of them. The voice of the Father speaks. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And then Luke chapter 9, verse 36. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. Moses, gone. Elijah, gone. The law has been fulfilled. The prophets have spoken everything they were sent to speak. What remains is Jesus, alone. The Old Testament has handed off, in one image, on one mountain. But not everyone was watching. In Jerusalem, opposition to Jesus had been building for months. And when he raises Lazarus from the tomb, the Sanhedrin meets in emergency session. They know the crowds are shifting. They know Rome is watching. And Caiaphas, the high priest, delivers the verdict. It is better for you that one man should die for the people, than that the whole nation should perish. John records a note about that sentence. Caiaphas spoke it as a prophecy, without understanding what he was saying. He was solving a political problem. He was, unknowingly, describing the plan God had held since Genesis 3. The high priest pronounced the sentence. God had written the script. 7 days. The most documented week in ancient history. And every single detail is loaded. He enters Jerusalem on a donkey. Palm branches. Shouts of Hosanna. All 4 Gospels record it. But Luke adds a detail the others do not. At a specific point on the descent from the Mount of Olives, Jesus stops. He looks at the city, and he weeps, not for himself, for Jerusalem. Luke chapter 19, verse 42. If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Then a specific phrase. Because you did not know the time of your visitation. The word Luke uses is episkope, used throughout the Old Testament for God arriving to act in history. Jesus is telling Jerusalem plainly that it had a specific moment to recognize who had arrived. It had a day. and it missed it. That night, they gather for the Passover meal. Every observant Jew in that room knew the meal by heart. 1,400 years of tradition. 4 cups, each cup with a specific meaning. Jesus takes the third cup, the cup of redemption. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many. He is citing Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31. The prophecy of a new covenant, written on hearts and not on stone. The Passover lamb for 1,400 years had been a preview. The original was arriving in the morning. After the meal, he crosses the Kidron Valley to a garden called Gethsemane. He takes Peter, James, and John, the same 3 who saw the transfiguration. He tells them he is sorrowful, even to death. He walks a stone's throw further, and he kneels. Luke, the physician, records what happens next. His sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Modern medicine has a name for that condition: hematidrosis, a documented physiological response to extreme psychological distress. 3 prayers, the same prayer. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. 3 times. The answer was the same each time. He had 33 years to think about this moment. Every prayer, every teaching, every miracle. He knew exactly where it was heading. He knew the nails. He knew the crown of thorns. He knew the 6 trials and the tearing curtain. And in that garden, on that night, he asked if it could be different. 3 times. The answer was the same each time. In the book of Genesis, the first man was also in a garden. He was also given a choice. He chose himself. This man chose otherwise. The soldiers arrive. Judas identifies him with a kiss. The disciples scatter. And what follows is the most legally scrutinized prosecution in ancient history. 6 separate hearings. 6 presiding judges. Annas, the former high priest, removed from office by Rome but still wielding influence. He conducts the first interrogation, a hearing he has no legal standing to conduct. Caiaphas, his son-in-law, the current high priest. He convenes the Sanhedrin at night, and night trials for capital offenses were prohibited under their own tradition. They knew this. They did it anyway. The Sanhedrin. A dawn session called to formalize the verdict already reached. No waiting period between conviction and execution, as tradition required. They broke their own rules to reach a conclusion already decided. Then Rome, Pilate. First round. He listens. He interrogates. He returns to the crowd and says, in Luke chapter 23, verse 4, I find no guilt in this man, Herod Antipas, the client king of Galilee, in Jerusalem for the feast. Pilate sends the prisoner to him, hoping to shift jurisdiction. Herod questions him. Herod mocks him. Herod sends him back without a charge. Pilate, round 2. Under mounting pressure from the crowd, he says again, in Luke 23, verse 22, I have found in him no guilt deserving death. And then he signs the order. 6 judges. Every one of them declared the defendant innocent. Every one of them enabled the execution. He is scourged. He is mocked. A crown of thorns is forced onto his head, and he is led out to the hill. The timing is precise. John chapter 19, verse 14, places Jesus standing before Pilate around the 6th hour on Preparation Day. Directly across the Kidron Valley, in the temple courts, the Passover lambs were beginning to be slaughtered for the evening meal. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, John the Baptist had pointed at him and said one sentence, Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. This was the hour that sentence meant. He is nailed to the crossbeam he carried. He hangs there for 6 hours. And at the moment of his death, Matthew chapter 27, verse 51. The curtain of the temple tore in two, the curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, the barrier between the presence of God and everyone else. It tore from top to bottom, not from the bottom, the way a human being tears cloth, from the top, from the inside, from the room that had been empty for 600 years. God tore it himself. The thread held, even in death. 3 days later, the most important morning in human history, and no one was ready for it. The tomb is not treated casually in the New Testament. A Roman seal is placed across the stone. Breaking that seal was a capital offense. A guard unit is posted. Roman soldiers who fell asleep on duty were executed. And the stone itself is enormous, sealed into a groove designed to make removal from the inside impossible. Sunday morning, the stone is rolled away. But the detail most readers pass over is this: it is not rolled away to let Jesus out. Because John chapter 20, verse 19, records Jesus appearing inside a locked room later that same day. He did not need the stone moved to leave the tomb. The stone was rolled away to let witnesses in. And the first witnesses were women: Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Salome. This is a detail that most readers accept without noticing what it means. In first-century Jewish and Roman courts, a woman's testimony was legally inadmissible as evidence in most matters. Her word carried no formal weight in a court of law. If the Gospel writers were fabricating a story to convince first-century audiences, this is the last detail they would invent. They would name male witnesses: Peter, John, someone whose testimony would stand up in court. They record the women because it is what happened. Then Paul writes something extraordinary in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, a letter dated by scholars to around 55 A.D., roughly 25 years after the crucifixion. He appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. That is not a devotional statement. That is an evidence claim. Paul is telling his readers, go verify this. Most of the eyewitnesses are still walking around. Ask them. Later that same day, 2 disciples are walking the 7 miles from Jerusalem to a village called Emmaus. A stranger joins them on the road. They do not recognize him. They tell him about the crucifixion, about their hopes now dead, about the strange reports of an empty tomb. And Luke chapter 24, verse 27, records what the stranger does next. Beginning from Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself, the seed promised in Genesis 3, the covenant with Abraham, the Passover lamb, Isaiah's suffering servant, Zechariah's shepherd struck by the sword, Daniel's son of man, every thread, converging here on a dusty road. In a conversation we were not given. When they reach the village, they urge the stranger to stay for the evening meal. He takes the bread. He breaks it. He blesses it. The same gesture, from the upper room. And in that moment, they recognize him. He vanishes, the thread held through the tomb. 40 days later, on a mountain in Galilee, Jesus meets the 11 remaining disciples one final time, and he speaks a sentence that becomes the legal charter for everything that follows. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Not some authority, all of it. Then he ascends, not retreating, taking the throne. 10 days later, Pentecost, 50 days after Passover. Jewish tradition associated the Feast of Pentecost with the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. 50 days after the Exodus Passover. Old Covenant at Sinai, New Covenant at Pentecost, on the same calendar anniversary. The disciples are gathered together in one room, and the Spirit falls, The house shakes. What looks like fire rests on each of them, and they begin to speak in languages they had never learned. Jerusalem is packed for the feast. Every nation in the known world is represented, and each of them hears the disciples speaking in their own native tongue simultaneously. In Genesis chapter 11, God scattered the nations at the Tower of Babel by confusing their languages. In Acts chapter 2, God begins to gather the nations by reversing the confusion. Pentecost is Babel in reverse. Peter stands and preaches. 3,000 people are baptized that day. The church exploded. And the man most responsible for carrying it to the world was not yet a Christian. Acts chapter 7 records the execution of a man named Stephen, the first Christian martyr, stoned outside Jerusalem for preaching about the Messiah. At the scene of that execution stands a young Pharisee. He is holding the coats of the men throwing the stones. His name is Saul of Tarsus. He does not stop there. He is appointed to lead a systematic persecution program. City by city, synagogue by synagogue. Acts chapter 9 verse 1 describes him this way: breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He carries letters of authority from the high priest. He is traveling to Damascus with orders to arrest every Christian he can find and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. And on the road to Damascus, at midday, a light brighter than the sun. The Greek word Luke uses is exaphnes, suddenly, without warning. It is the same word the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, uses in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. The Lord you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Saul falls to the ground. He hears a voice. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He gets up blind. He is led by the hand into Damascus. 3 days. No sight, no food, no water. Then a disciple named Ananias, who has been warned in a vision, comes and lays hands on him. His sight is restored. And within days, Saul, the man who came to arrest the Christians, is preaching in the synagogues of Damascus. Acts chapter 9, verse 21, records the reaction of everyone who heard him. All who heard him were amazed. This was the man who came to destroy this movement. Now he is its most dangerous evangelist. Over the next 3 decades, Paul writes 13 letters. But those letters are not theological essays composed at leisure. They are triage documents, crisis communication, written to communities on fire. Romans is written to a church splitting over Jewish and Gentile tension. Paul opens with 3 chapters of prosecutorial precision. Every human being, religious or irreligious, stands guilty before God. Then 12 chapters explaining why this is the best news in human history. Galatians is written in alarm. False teachers had arrived after Paul left, telling Gentile converts they had to keep the entire Jewish law. Every other letter of Paul's begins with a customary thanksgiving. Galatians skips it entirely. It begins, "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting." No pleasantries. Pure alarm. Philippians is written from a Roman prison. Paul is awaiting a trial that may end in his execution. And the letter contains the word rejoice 16 times. Not once does it contain a complaint. Embedded in Philippians chapter 2 is a passage that many scholars consider an early Christian hymn, a song the church was already singing before Paul quoted it. Philippians was written approximately 20 years before the earliest of the 4 Gospels, which means the church was already worshiping Jesus as pre-existent, divine, and returning to reign before a single gospel was written. The high Christology did not develop slowly over centuries. It was there from the beginning. Then Nero, mid-60s, A.D., Christians burned as torches to light his gardens, thrown to lions, crucified on the roads outside Rome. Peter is executed. Paul is executed. but the letters survive, copied by hand, passed church to church. The empire tried to end the name. The name spread faster, and Paul was not the only voice. An anonymous letter, now called Hebrews, argued that every Old Testament priest, every sacrifice, every temple ritual was a shadow pointing forward to Jesus. The earthly temple, Hebrews argued, was never the destination. It was always a signpost. James, Peter, John, and Jude wrote to communities under the same pressure. 27 books, 9 writers. And then something happened that made revelation necessary. The signpost Hebrews called a shadow was about to burn to the ground. And then, 70 A.D., Jesus had said it 40 years earlier, standing on the Mount of Olives, looking at the temple. Not one stone will be left on another. Roman General Titus surrounds Jerusalem. The siege lasts 5 months. Famine inside the walls, Rome outside. The temple burns, every stone thrown down. The institution that had defined Jewish worship for 1,000 years, the sacrifices, the priesthood, the Holy of Holies, ends permanently. Jesus said it would happen within that generation. It did. The question the remaining churches were now asking was no longer whether the promise had survived. They knew it had. The question was what heaven was seeing right now, while they were dying on earth. From a small island prison in the Aegean Sea, the last surviving apostle was about to find out. 95 A.D. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, the Emperor Domitian demanded a title that no previous emperor had claimed during his own lifetime. Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Christians who refuse the title are executed or exiled. John, the last surviving apostle, now an old man, is exiled to a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos. The churches he spent decades building are being torn apart across the empire. And on that island, John receives what he calls, in the opening verse of his final book, an apocalypsis. Most readers translate that word as revelation, and that translation is accurate, but it misses the exact shape of what the word means. Apocalypsis means an unveiling, a drawing back of the curtain, not the announcement of what will someday happen, the exposure of what is already true, but hidden. John is not being given a timetable. He is being given a perspective. The message to the 7 churches in the opening chapters is not, hang on until it gets better someday. The message is, the Lamb has already won. The scroll is already open. The story already ends. The answer to persecution is not escape. It is the throne room. The 7 churches John writes to are not symbols. They are 7 real congregations in 7 real cities in Asia Minor. And the order in which they appear is not spiritual. It is geographic. It is the exact sequence of the Roman postal route through the province. A courier would have carried this letter from city to city in exactly that order. Each letter delivers a precise diagnosis. Smyrna is the poorest church, about to face imprisonment, facing genuine persecution. And Jesus writes to that church without a single rebuke, only encouragement. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Laodicea is the wealthiest church, comfortable, prosperous, well-fed, and Jesus writes, you are neither cold nor hot. Laodicea's water supply was famously lukewarm. It came through stone aqueducts from distant springs, arriving in the city tepid, undrinkable. Every reader of that letter knew the metaphor immediately. The wealthiest church, the most spiritually bankrupt. These are not general principles. These are real people, reading a real letter, in real cities, about real conditions Jesus is naming precisely. Then, in chapters 4 and 5, John is taken up into the throne room of heaven. He sees a scroll in the right hand of the one seated on the throne, sealed with 7 seals, and no one in heaven or on earth is worthy to open the scroll. John weeps, because if the scroll cannot be opened, the story cannot end. Then an elder speaks, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered." John turns to see the lion, and he sees a lamb, standing as though slain. The lamb takes the scroll, and the throne room erupts. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might, and honor and glory and blessing. Every knee, every voice, every creature in heaven and earth, and under the earth. The lion had been announced, but the Lion of Judah, the conquering king of the Old Testament, came in the shape of a slain lamb. The conquest happened through the crucifixion. That is what heaven celebrates. That is what the 7 churches, dying under Domitian, needed to see. Later in the same book, John describes something else, the mark of the beast, the image every empire in history has demanded from its citizens. The Greek word John uses for that mark is charagma, the technical term used in that century for the imperial seal stamped onto Roman official documents and coins. John's readers understood it instantly. Domitian's empire was demanding a loyalty stamp. The Lamb offers a different one. Then, in the final 2 chapters of Revelation, John sees the ending, a new heaven, a new earth. The Greek word John uses is kainos, not destroyed and replaced, renewed, qualitatively transformed, a garden city descending from heaven, the river of life running through its center. The tree of life, the same tree that was barred to humanity in Genesis 3, is open again. Its leaves for the healing of the nations. The same geography as Eden, but now a city, humanity and God, dwelling together, face to face. And there is no serpent. The scroll is opened. The story ends. Eden is fully restored. The promise has finally arrived at its destination. The New Testament opened with a question no one dared to ask out loud. After 400 years of silence, had God forgotten? It ends with an image so complete that no question remains. A garden city, the tree of life open, the river of life running through the center. No temple needed, because God Himself is the temple. No sun needed, because the glory of God is the light. And no serpent. Between those 2 images, between the 400 years of silence and the city with no serpent, is everything you just heard. The seed of Genesis 3 arrived in a stable, hunted from birth, tested in the wilderness, confronting a nation that had forgotten what it was for, executed by 6 judges who all agreed he was innocent, rising from a sealed tomb, sending His Spirit, building a church across an empire that spent centuries trying to erase Him. None of it was accidental. None of it was sentimental. All of it was on purpose. The thread held through the cross, through the tomb, through Nero's fire and Domitian's exile, through every generation since that has tried to bury it, dismiss it, forget it, or replace it. It held. And it did not just hold through history. It held so it could reach you. Whatever silence you are sitting in right now, the promise has crossed 400 years of silence before. It knows the way through. The New Testament does not end with a history lesson. It ends with a question. Are you holding the thread? Because the closer you look, the more you find. If this video gave you the picture you were missing, share it with one person who has been reading the New Testament in pieces their entire life. And subscribe, because these letters were never written to isolated individuals. They were written to communities holding the line together. That is what we are building here. Tell me in the comments which moment changed how you see the story. And if you want to understand the Old Testament as well, I have a video on this channel that will walk you through the complete story. Click the video on your screen right now and watch it. It will bless you.